Today, we are not gathered to decide who is a villain in an organization, nor to determine which individual is responsible for conflict or dysfunction. That would be far too simple. The purpose of this lecture is far more fundamental. We are here to learn how organizations begin to collapse quietly, invisibly, and often without anyone realizing it until it is too late. Most institutional failures do not begin with open rebellion or dramatic conflict. They begin with subtle structural shifts. A company may still look successful on the surface. A community may still appear harmonious. A family may still seem stable. Yet internally, something has already begun to decay. And the most dangerous part is this: almost no one notices it in time. But if we learn to recognize the early signals, if we develop the ability to see structural distortions before they fully mature, many unnecessary conflicts, failures, and institutional breakdowns can be prevented. To understand this process, I want to borrow an idea from an unexpected source. The ancient Tibetan spiritual text, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes a state known as bardo. Bardo is the intermediate state between death and rebirth, a psychological and spiritual passage where consciousness becomes vulnerable to illusion. According to the text, the greatest obstacle in bardo is not external danger. It is attachment. Attachment to familiar voices. Attachment to comforting illusions. Attachment to intermediaries that appear helpful but ultimately obscure truth. In a strangely similar way, organizations experience their own form of bardo. When an institution becomes overly dependent on particular individuals, when information begins to pass through unofficial intermediaries rather than direct communication, when interpretation replaces fact, the organization has already entered its own bardo state. Externally, everything still looks stable. Internally, clarity has begun to dissolve. And today's lecture is essentially a training in how to see through that fog. We are not here to accuse anyone. We are not here to label individuals as villains. Instead, we are here to develop a structural awareness, to learn how to read the signals that indicate a system is drifting toward instability. Because when organizations fail, they almost always say the same thing afterward: we didn't see it coming. At first, everything seemed fine. We thought that person was helping the organization. But when researchers study institutional failures over long periods, whether in corporations, governments, communities, or even families, they notice something fascinating. Certain roles appear again and again. Not the obvious leaders, not the obvious rebels, but someone positioned quietly in between departments, between conversations, between reports, between conflicts, the middleman. Today we will call a specific type of middleman the distortion personality. This is not simply a bad person, nor is it merely someone with flawed character. Rather, it is a behavioral pattern that emerges within certain organizational environments. A distortion personality repeatedly occupies the space between people and gradually reshapes information as it travels through them. Facts become interpretations. Concerns become complaints. Observations become accusations. And responsibility becomes increasingly difficult to locate. What makes this dynamic so dangerous is that the distortion personality rarely appears hostile. On the contrary, they often appear helpful, responsive, dedicated, diplomatic. They frequently position themselves as communicators. I'm just passing along what I heard. I'm only trying to coordinate between both sides. I'm simply delivering the message. At first glance, this looks like loyalty to the organization. But here is the critical question we must ask. Why must communication pass through this person at all? Why are people no longer speaking directly? Why do facts arrive only after they have been interpreted? Healthy organizations tend to share a very simple structural characteristic. Information travels through clear channels. Reports are documented. Statements belong to their speakers. Conflicts are resolved through direct dialogue. But as organizations begin to deteriorate, certain patterns appear. You begin to hear phrases like, "I heard that someone said," They told me you might be upset. I'm just relaying what others feel. At the same time, written communication declines. Verbal interpretation increases. And gradually, no one can clearly identify who actually made a decision. Conflicts do not disappear. Instead, they mutate. They reappear in new forms, with slightly different narratives, over and over again. At the center of these dynamics is what we call the middleman structure. A middleman structure emerges when individuals who possess little formal authority begin to control informal information flows. They become interpreters of emotion, gatekeepers of conversation, and sometimes invisible influencers of decision-making. However, the most important thing to understand is this: a middleman structure is never created by a single individual alone. It only becomes powerful when the organization itself allows it. 3 conditions typically enable its formation. First, a culture that avoids direct communication. Second, leadership that fears confrontation. Third, evaluation systems that reward maintaining harmony more than accountability. When these 3 conditions exist simultaneously, distortion personalities do not need to fight for influence. They naturally move toward the center of the system. And once the structure solidifies, the organization slowly stops operating based on facts. Instead, people begin to evaluate situations according to 3 different criteria: who delivered the message, what tone it was delivered with, and who might be offended by it. Truth becomes secondary. Narrative becomes dominant. But in this lecture, we are not labeling distortion personalities as evil individuals. That would be intellectually lazy. Instead, we define them differently. A distortion personality is simply the human type that gains influence fastest within structurally ambiguous systems. Which leads us to the real question this lecture seeks to answer. The important question is not who is dangerous. The real question is what signals indicate that an organization has already entered the danger zone, because collapse rarely begins with noise. It begins with silence. The first signal is surprisingly subtle. It is the excessive desire to relay messages. When communication becomes dominated by people who are eager to deliver messages on behalf of others, something deeper is changing within the organization. And this is where the illness quietly begins. In healthy systems, communication has 3 characteristics. First, messages are delivered only when requested. Second, the content remains factual. Third, the relay leads quickly to direct conversation between the original parties. Distortion personalities operate differently. Their communication contains 3 predictable patterns. First, the relay is unsolicited. No one asks them to deliver the message, but they volunteer anyway. I thought you should know. I figured it would be better if I told you. You might want to hear this. At that moment, control over the information subtly shifts from the original speaker to the intermediary. Second, interpretation replaces fact. They rarely say, "Someone said this." Instead, they say, "They seemed uncomfortable. The atmosphere felt tense. I don't think that was a real intention." Now, the organization is no longer consuming information. It is consuming interpretation. Third, the relay repeats endlessly, but resolution never occurs. The same conflict returns again and again in different forms. Why? Because the direct conversation that could resolve the issue never happens. And this reveals the underlying mechanism. For distortion personalities, communication is not a tool for solving problems. It is a tool for strengthening their position. Through relaying messages, they become the source of information, the interpreter of emotions, the gatekeeper of conflict. Gradually, other members of the organization begin to adapt. They start saying things like, "Maybe we should talk to them first. If we speak directly, things might get worse." They're good at mediating. At that exact moment, the organization is already stepped into. The early stage of a middleman structure. Another defining characteristic of distortion communication is this: responsibility never remains attached to the messenger. They can always retreat. I never said that myself. I just delivered both sides. That's simply what I heard. The final outcome becomes predictable. Conflict exists, but no one owns it. Facts become blurred, and the organization grows increasingly exhausted. Over time, the real damage is not the argument itself. The damage is the erosion of trust. Because once communication is repeatedly distorted through intermediaries, people begin to doubt not only the message, but the entire system through which the message travels. And this is precisely how relationships collapse. Not through dramatic betrayal, but through quiet distortion. Understanding this structure gives you a powerful advantage. Once you recognize these signals, you are no longer easily manipulated by them. And more importantly, you can begin to protect the integrity of communication within the organization. Because the first step in preserving any institution, whether a company, a community, or a relationship, is not changing people. It is learning to see the structure clearly. And in the next part of this lecture, we will explore the second signal of distortion personalities. Their tendency not merely to relay conflicts, but to own them. They do not resolve conflict. They control it. And that is where the true shift of power begins. In the previous part of this lecture, we examined a subtle but powerful signal that appears in organizations before serious dysfunction begins. Communication gradually stops moving directly between people. Instead, it begins to travel through intermediaries. Messages become interpretations, and responsibility slowly dissolves. Once that pattern appears, a deeper transformation often follows. The intermediary does not simply relay communication anymore. They begin to control conflict itself. And this leads us to the second signal of the distortion personality. But before we examine the distorted form of mediation, we must first understand what healthy mediation actually looks like. Because not every mediator is dangerous. In fact, when practiced correctly, mediation can be one of the most constructive forces inside any organization, family, or community. Healthy mediation has three very clear characteristics. First, it is temporary. Second, it has a clear and limited purpose. Third, its ultimate goal is always direct dialogue between the original parties. Let me illustrate this with a simple workplace example. Imagine two colleagues in a company who become upset over the wording of a single sentence in an email. It happens more often than we like to admit. One person interprets the tone as criticism. The other insists it was simply efficiency. In this situation, a healthy mediator steps in briefly and clarifies the nature of the misunderstanding. They might say something like, "This does not appear to be a problem of attitude. It seems to be a difference in how the wording was interpreted." Then they do something extremely important. They step aside. They say, "Now it would be best for both of you to discuss this directly." And the mediation ends. The mediator disappears. This same principle applies in close relationships as well. In a marriage, for instance, there are moments when emotions run too high for productive conversation. At that moment, a counselor or mediator may temporarily help both partners calm down. But the goal is never to replace their communication. Instead, the mediator defines a clear objective. Today, we are not trying to decide whether this marriage survives or ends. We are simply trying to understand why that one sentence caused pain. Once that understanding begins to emerge, the mediator again withdraws. The couple must face each other directly. The same dynamic appears in schools. When two students are involved in a conflict, a responsible teacher does not simply impose a solution. Instead, the teacher verifies the facts, creates a space where apologies and agreements can occur, and then allows the students themselves to take responsibility for the relationship. A healthy mediator is someone who is always prepared to disappear. Their success is measured not by how long they remain involved, but by how quickly they become unnecessary. From a philosophical perspective, this principle echoes an insight found in the spiritual tradition, often referred to as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In that text, the intermediate state between death and rebirth is called Bardo. Bardo is not meant to be a place of residence. It is a passage, a moment of clarity in which consciousness must recognize reality and move forward. Healthy mediation functions in a very similar way. It helps people pass through their moment of confusion quickly and clearly. The mediator does not live the experience for them. The mediator simply helps them see the light that allows them to move forward. However, this is precisely where the distortion personality begins to operate differently. Distorted mediation has its own recognizable structure. Just like healthy mediation, it often begins with seemingly reasonable intentions. But over time, three distinct patterns appear. First, the mediation becomes continuous rather than temporary. Second, its purpose becomes increasingly vague. Third, direct conversation between the parties is repeatedly delayed. Many of you may have encountered someone like this. They often say things such as, "Right now, it might be better if you don't talk directly. I'll communicate with both sides for the time being. Let me observe the situation a little longer." At first, this sounds like thoughtful caution. But something strange happens. Weeks pass. Months pass, and the conflict never truly resolves. In fact, communication begins to flow only through that mediator. The intermediary becomes the permanent channel. This structure appears in families as well. Between parents and children, or between siblings, sometimes one person begins to speak for everyone. Mom doesn't really mean that. Your brother is just stressed right now. Let me explain what she actually intended. Gradually, direct conversation disappears. Dialogue is always postponed until later. In organizations, the pattern becomes even clearer. Between senior leadership and junior staff, a particular individual may begin to handle all communication. Reports, complaints, emotional reactions, everything flows through them. From the outside, it may look like harmony has been restored, but in reality, the conflict has not disappeared. Power has simply accumulated in the middle. From the perspective of the Bardo metaphor, this is an extremely dangerous development. Remember that Bardo is supposed to be a transitional state. It is meant to be passed through. With the distortion personality transforms Bardo into a permanent structure. Instead of helping others move beyond confusion, they create a system where people remain dependent on their interpretation. Gradually, individuals stop trusting their own judgment. They begin relying on the mediator's voice. And here we encounter one of the most profound warnings contained in the Tibetan spiritual tradition. The most dangerous illusion is not a frightening voice. It is a familiar voice that begins to sound like truth. The distortion mediator becomes precisely that voice. As a result, conflict is never truly resolved. It is merely managed, and a structure emerges in which nothing moves unless the mediator is involved. This is not mediation. It is the extension of dependency. So we must ask a deeper question. Why do distortion personalities avoid resolving conflict? Why does the conflict seem to persist wherever they operate? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because the moment conflict disappears, their organizational necessity disappears with it. When conflict ends, there is no longer a need for someone to relay messages. There is no need for an intermediary to interpret emotions. There is no need for someone to coordinate communication. And at that moment, the distortion personality becomes something very uncomfortable. They become unnecessary. Let us consider a practical example. In a company team, two employees, let us call them A and B, have been in tension for months. Between them stands a third person, C. C constantly reassures both sides. I'm coordinating things between you. Right now, it might be better not to speak directly. Eventually, senior leadership intervenes and encourages A and B to talk directly. Within a single conversation, much of the misunderstanding disappears. Now something interesting happens. No one seeks out C anymore. Communication lines become simple, and people begin asking an uncomfortable question. Why did we need that intermediary in the first place? The same pattern appears inside families. A self-appointed peacekeeper constantly relays messages between relatives. But when the family members finally speak openly to each other, many misunderstandings dissolve immediately. Suddenly someone says, "Maybe we don't need you to carry messages anymore." And with that sentence, the emotional influence of the intermediary collapses. The same transformation occurs in communities, religious groups, and even political structures. When transparency replaces rumor, the role of the distortion messenger disappears. Their influence depends entirely on ambiguity. In psychological terms, distortion personalities often become attached to the state of conflict itself. Conflict provides meaning. Conflict provides relevance. Conflict provides power. Without conflict, their role loses definition. This brings us back to the philosophical insight we discussed earlier. The Tibetan teachings describe attachment as the force that traps consciousness in the bardo state. Attachment to fear. Attachment to identity. Attachment to the belief that I must exist in this role. Distortion personalities often live inside a social version of this attachment. They remain in the middle state of conflict because it is the only place where their identity feels meaningful. But genuine mediation is the opposite. True mediation is willing to disappear. True mediation does not build dependency. True mediation restores responsibility to the people who actually own the relationship. So whenever you encounter a mediator in any system, whether in an organization, a family, or a community, there are two very important questions to ask. Does this mediation have an ending? And does this person help the parties face each other directly or quietly prevent that meeting? If mediation becomes a permanent structure, it stops being a bridge. It becomes a room, and the longer people remain inside that room, the more peaceful it may appear from the outside. But inside, something else is happening. Truth slowly becomes distorted. Responsibility becomes diluted. And conflict, rather than disappearing, becomes a quiet and permanent resident. That is the moment when mediation stops serving relationships and begins serving power. And in the next part of this series, we will explore a deeper question: why distortion personalities are so skilled at collecting information, interpreting it, and strategically reshaping the narrative inside organizations. Because once you understand that mechanism, you will begin to recognize signals of manipulation long before the system reaches collapse. If today's lecture helps sharpen your awareness of these hidden structures, consider sharing it with others who navigate complex organizations and relationships. Awareness is the first defense against invisible power. And in the next lecture, we will examine the strategic patterns through which distortion personalities gather influence and how those patterns can finally be recognized and neutralized.